In general, when talking about World War II, little is said about the true first fascist. Although his figure has been overshadowed historically by Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, who ruled Italy from 1922 to 1943, also brutally killed thousands of people and actively participated on the Axis side. After being executed on April 28, 1945, his body and that of his lover, Clara Petacci, were displayed and subjected to all kinds of humiliations in a square in Milan.
Killed Mussolini. The bodies of the ex-dictator, his mistress, and fellow fascists were left lying in the square, and the enraged Italians took the opportunity of kicking them and flinging rubbish on them.
In today's video, we will explore Mussolini's figure, his biography, his rise and fall from power, and his tragic and deserved end, executed by an oppressed people. Get ready to travel to Italy in the early 20th century in another exciting installment of military history. Let's begin. In ancient Rome, the word fasces referred to a weapon consisting of a bundle of wooden rods, sometimes even containing the edge of an axe. Used by Roman authorities to punish offenders, fasces came to symbolize the authority of the state. In the 19th century, Italians began using the word to designate political groups united by common goals. This violent symbol would be the origin of fascism, founded by today's video protagonist. Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883 in Predappio, a small town in central Italy. Born into a humble family, his father was a blacksmith and his mother a schoolteacher. Benito grew up with stories of nationalism and political heroism from his socialist father. Solitary and socially awkward, he got into trouble at an early age due to his intransigence and violence towards his classmates. He studied teaching and became a teacher, a profession that would later serve him in journalism. As a young man, he moved to Switzerland and became a declared socialist. Over time, he returned to Italy, having been expelled from Switzerland for joining radicalized political groups, and established himself as a journalist. Mussolini founded several newspapers, honing the propaganda that he would later use as a tool during fascism. He even wrote in his articles that it would have been necessary to shoot half a dozen deputies to set a healthy example for other partisans. When World War I broke out in 1914, Italy remained neutral. However, Mussolini wanted his nation to join the conflict, leading to a clash with the Italian Socialist Party, which expelled him for supporting the war. In response, he formed his own political movement, the Fasci of Revolutionary Action, whose goal was to encourage entry into the war. Eventually, Italy joined the First World War in 1915. Mussolini became increasingly convinced that society should not be organized based on social class or political affiliation, but around a strong national identity. He believed that only a ruthless and energetic dictator could cleanse Italy and restore its national promise. To achieve this, he began fostering this sentiment in the youth to gain support. This would be a strategy he would maintain throughout his political career, as seen in the following material. While he was not yet the revered figure we have just seen in the footage, after the war, Mussolini was not alone. Many Italians were disgruntled by the Treaty of Versailles. They felt that the agreement, which redistributed the territory of aggressor nations, did not respect Italy by giving it too little land. Slowly, a breeding ground of discontent was forming. ideal for the violence that was to come. In 1919, Mussolini founded a paramilitary movement called the Italian Combat Fasci, a combat-focused squad intended to mobilize war-hardened veterans who could restore glory to Italy. Mussolini hoped to translate the nation's discontent into political success, but the fledgling party suffered a humiliating defeat in the parliamentary elections that year, garnering only 2,420 votes, compared to the 1.02 million of the Socialist Party. This pleased his enemies in Milan, who celebrated a mock funeral in his honor. Undeterred, Mussolini began courting other groups opposed to the socialists. Industrialists and merchants fearing strikes and stoppages, rural landowners reluctant to lose their land, and members of political parties abhorring the growing popularity of socialism. These groups would become valuable support for the future Italian dictator's plan. Mussolini's powerful allies helped finance the paramilitary wing of his movement, known as the Blackshirts. Although Mussolini professed to be against oppression and censorship of any kind, the group soon became known for its willingness to use violence for political gain. The Blackshirts terrorized socialists and Mussolini's personal enemies throughout the country. The year 1920 was very bloody, with fascists marching through cities, beating and even killing union leaders, and de facto taking control of local authorities. However, the Italian government, which shared the fascist enmity towards socialists, did little to nothing to curb the violence. Here is archival footage of this paramilitary force. At the end of it, you can see how heavily armed they were. While Mussolini only controlled a fraction of the militias at that time, his image of toughness contributed to forging his reputation as a powerful and authoritarian leader, capable of backing up his words with violent and decisive actions. During this time, the nickname he had given himself began to popularize among his followers, Il Duce. The Duke wielded powerful influence over Italians, seducing them with his personal charm and persuasive rhetoric. In 1921, Mussolini won a seat in parliament and was even invited to join the coalition government by the Italian prime minister, who assumed that Mussolini would calm his Blackshirts once given a share of political power. However, the government had misjudged Mussolini, who instead intended to use his paramilitary forces to seize absolute control. By late 1921, Mussolini transformed his group into the National Fascist Party, turning a movement that had about 30,000 members in 1920 into a political party with 320,000 members in less than 2 years. Although he declared war on the state, the Italian government could not dissolve the party and remained on the sidelines as the fascists took over most of northern Italy. Mussolini saw the opportunity for the final blow in the summer of 1922. The socialists had announced a strike not in the name of workers' emancipation, but as a desperate cry for the state to end fascist violence. Mussolini managed to portray the strike as proof that the government was weak and unable to rule. With new supporters wanting law and order, Il Duce decided it was time to take power. On October 25, 1922, a day after his meeting in Naples with the authorities, Mussolini appointed 4 party leaders to lead their members to the country's capital. Poorly trained and ill-equipped, these men would likely have lost a battle with the Italian army, but Mussolini intended to intimidate the government into surrendering without sparking a civil war. The dictator had a charismatic power and popular support that shook the political elite in Rome. While Mussolini stayed in Milan, his supporters marched toward the Italian capital, leaving chaos and destruction in their wake, even taking over government buildings in several cities. Luigi Facta, the prime minister at the time, attempted to impose martial law, but the king believed that Mussolini could establish stability and refused to sign the order that would have mobilized Italian troops against the fascists. In protest, Facta and his cabinet resigned on the morning of October 28th. Armed with a telegram from the king inviting him to form a cabinet, Mussolini boarded a sleeping car and embarked on a calm and triumphant 14-hour journey from Milan to Rome. On October 30th, he became prime minister and ordered his men to parade past the king's residence as they left the city. For over 20 years, the dictator who had seized power by force would lead the Italian government. King Victor Emmanuel, exhausted by the World War and a state of almost civil war in Italy, had assumed that Mussolini would impose order. However, in 3 years, the Duke became an absolute dictator, displacing even the king from decision-making. Over time, Mussolini increased his own power while curtailing the civil rights of the population and creating a propagandistic police state. His agenda went beyond domestic affairs, as Mussolini's imperial ambitions led Italy to occupy the Greek island of Corfu, invade Ethiopia, and ally with Nazi Germany, ultimately resulting in the murder of 8,500 Italians in the Holocaust, and leaving Italy on the darker side of history. Here is footage of the dictator making the announcement of entering the war. Mussolini's insatiable hunger for power would be his downfall, as his blindness led his country into World War II as part of the Axis, aligned with the seemingly unstoppable Adolf Hitler. This decision left the Italian nation destroyed and isolated for much of the 20th century. King Victor Emmanuel III, seeing the war already well advanced, convinced Mussolini's closest allies to turn against him. On July 25, 1943, they finally managed to remove him from power and place him under arrest. However, after a dramatic escape from prison, Mussolini fled to the Italian territory occupied by Germany, where, under Hitler's pressure, he signed a humiliating agreement, turning his nation into a weak and ephemeral puppet state. From that moment on, it would be a debacle for the Axis, particularly for Italy. On April 18, 1945, with the war already lost, one of the greatest acts of cowardice in military history occurred. Mussolini was in Milan participating in a meeting to plan resistance when news arrived that Waffen-SS General Karl Wolff had requested the cessation of hostilities on that same day. Il Duce adamantly refused to surrender, putting on a spectacle with much bluster, speaking of honor and courage. However, as the Italian Social Republic crumbled, Mussolini decided to escape, disguised as a soldier in a German convoy, like a rat. In his escape, the dictator left behind his wife, Rachel Guidi, and his 5 children, but took his lover, Clara Petacci, with him. At 6:30 in the morning on April 27, 1945, the convoy was detected near the province of Como by a group of communist partisans. After a fierce exchange of gunfire, the Nazis decided to surrender, as they had no loyalty or respect for Il Duce. The partisans allowed the withdrawal of the Germans in exchange for the surrender of all Italians. Around 7 in the evening, as the partisans were checking the documentation of the prisoners left behind after the Germans' departure, one of them recognized Mussolini and arrested him immediately. That night, news of the dictator's arrest reached Milan, and the one responsible for broadcasting it on the radio was the future president of the Republic, Sandro Pertini, who announced that the decision of the National Liberation Committee, or CLN, was that Mussolini should be shot like a rabid dog. The partisans transporting Il Duce and his lover stopped in the small town of Villa Belmonte, where both were led to a wall to be shot. In a first attempt, the weapons failed, but after the second, the lovers fell riddled with bullets. On April 28, 1945, the corpses were transported to Milan by truck. During the journey, no one was allowed to approach the bodies until they reached Loreto Square in the Lombard capital. There, Mussolini's corpse was brutally stoned, kicked, and shot, with some people even urinating on it. His face was completely disfigured, and after the beating, the police force composed of partisans and firefighters hung Mussolini, Petacci, and other fascist leaders upside down at a gas station in the square.
Firemen were called in to disperse the mob, who were by now, well, what shall we say, perhaps a trifle overexcited. The final ghastly scene was the hanging of the bodies upside down outside a petrol station. Well, at least it's a warning to all remaining fascists everywhere.
This act of revenge was a consequence of the humiliations suffered by the bodies of 15 anti-fascist partisans, which were hanged in the same place. Hours later, local CLN leaders decided to end the macabre display and remove the bodies, which were placed in wooden boxes with straw inside and buried in anonymous graves. Mussolini's tomb, lacking a name and identified only by the number 384, was desecrated on April 23, 1946, by a group of fascists who stole the body. This marked the beginning of an unusual journey for Il Duce's remains. Finally, on May 7th, one of the thieves, Domenico Laccisi, handed over the remains to Father Perini of the Milanese convent of Sant'Angelo. The corpse was placed in a tiny box, since several fingers and other body fragments were lost during constant transfers. The church and authorities then decided to hide the body in the Capuchin convent of Cerro Maggiore, where the superior first concealed it under an altar, and then, due to the bad odor, in a cupboard. The body of the once most powerful man in Italy remained there until 1957, when the government returned the remains to the widow. Since then, the dictator, or what's left of him, rests in the San Casiano Cemetery in Predapio, in the Emilia-Romagna region, precisely in the town where he was born in 1883. Mussolini's tomb has become a kind of tourist attraction and serves as a reminder of how brutal and devastating fascism was for the Italian nation.
Joseph Stalin is one of the most famous figures in human history. He was born into a poor family as the son of a violent father, and in time became the top dictator of the Soviet Union. He ruled with an iron fist, exterminating all those who opposed him, and led a ferocious war against the ranks of Adolf Hitler. During the 30 years that he remained at the top of power, he used terror to quiet the population and consolidate a particular communist regime, which had him as the center of a cult of personality. No one suspected that a man of such audacity, cunning and ruthless like few others, would meet with a pathetic and painful end. In his last moments, the dictator ended up reaping what he had sown throughout his entire life. Do not move from your screen, because in the next few minutes, we will tell you everything about the terrible death of Stalin. For decades, no one dared to raise their voice against Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. The leader silenced his opponents using the NKVD, that is, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, a state body with police functions that allowed him to control national politics and manage it at will. The purges organized by the regime claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, many of them supporters of communism whose only sin was to disagree with the dictator. For these people, a summary execution by a shot to the head or a long stay in a gulag, the regime's concentration camps, awaited. Despite his power and the image of greatness he tried to project, the truth is that he was still a human being with health problems. The stress of World War II took its toll on his body, and towards the end of the war his physical discomfort began to manifest itself in worrisome ways. The General Secretary was a heavy drinker, a habit he may have inherited from his father, who had been a hopeless alcoholic. Stalin followed in his footsteps and developed a fondness for drinking which, combined with his passion for tobacco, proved deadly. Towards the end of the war, he already had advanced atherosclerosis, a disease that causes the arteries to harden due to the accumulation of fat and cholesterol. The only way to keep this condition at bay was to watch his weight and quit smoking, two things the dictator never did. In April 1945, as World War II was drawing to a close, Stalin suffered a stroke. Although it was light and he recovered quickly, this prevented him from participating in the festivities that were held to celebrate the victory over Nazi Germany. At this event, the Secretary General was supposed to parade on horseback, saluting the population like a hero. Since he was in no condition to ride, these honors went to General Zhukov, who had led the Red Army. For his part, Stalin remained in Lenin's mausoleum, along with the other top brass of the Communist Party, watching the show and pretending that he was completely healthy. A few months later, in October 1945, his condition worsened when he suffered a heart attack. It was clear that he had to change his lifestyle if he wanted to continue living, so his doctors recommended that he relax and delegate government tasks to his subordinates. From this moment on, the dictator took longer and longer vacations, reaching the point of resting for 5 months in a row. On the other hand, he spent more and more time at his dacha, a personal residence located in the countryside, from where he directed the fate of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, as his body deteriorated, his psyche followed a similar path, and a growing paranoia gripped him. By 1952, Stalin's distrust of his doctors was complete, and he became convinced that they were plotting to remove him from power. Many health professionals were arrested and, under the orders of the dictator, subjected to terrible torture for revealing information about the alleged coup. On the night of February 28, 1953, Joseph Stalin summoned his circle of trust to his dacha to share an evening. The General Secretary used to do this, since self-imposed loneliness led him to depression. He liked to phone his friends, who were senior ministers and officials of the Soviet government, to invite them to have dinner and watch movies. The genre that he most enjoyed was, paradoxically, the Western, that is, the type of film par excellence produced in the United States, the great rival of communism. Among the diners that evening were Georgy Malenkov, the man everyone thought would be Stalin's successor, Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD and the person responsible for the arrest and death of thousands of people, Nikolai Bulganin, vice president of the Council of Ministers, and Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Moscow City Communist Party. It was a routine dinner, where alcohol, cigarettes, and political conversations abounded. Witnesses recall that Stalin was in a good mood, playing pranks on Khrushchev and laughing at everything. Around 4 in the morning, the guests left and the dictator went to his office to sleep. He ordered his guards not to disturb him until he had woken up and closed the door. However, the hours passed and Stalin did not appear, so the custodians were involved in a dilemma. On one hand, they had to raise the alarm, but on the other, they didn't want to risk upsetting the communist leader and then being reprimanded or, worse, arrested and sent to a gulag. That is why no one said anything until, at 11 p.m. on the 1st of March, the housekeeper entered the office and found a chilling image. Joseph Stalin was lying on the floor, in a t-shirt and pajama pants, unconscious and covered in a pool of urine. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev and Bulganin were telephoned and arrived at the dacha around dawn on March 2nd. At first, nobody wanted to bring a doctor because of the distrust that the dictator had towards health professionals. After much debate, a trusted doctor examined the dictator and noted that his blood pressure was too high, causing him to have a stroke. They moved his body to the sofa in the dining room, where they covered him with a rug so he wouldn't be cold. The doctors who examined him were terrified, as they thought that if their patient died, they would be accused of treason and killed. The chosen treatment was unusual, as it consisted of putting leeches on his face to drain blood and lower blood pressure. Stalin's sons were summoned to the dacha to see their father, who was half paralyzed and unresponsive. The eldest, the silly, was drunk, and began to shout that the dictator had been poisoned by his enemies. They had to remove him from the room so he wouldn't cause any more trouble. Although no one believed his words, the truth is that mistrust gripped the Secretary General's inner circle, and the men immediately began plotting to define who would take power after Stalin's death. At that point, everyone already considered him dead, and there were even those who suspected that Lavrenti Beria, the head of Soviet security, could have administered a toxic substance during the last meeting. However, this was never proven, and everything indicates that the Secretary General died due to his poor health and after a life of excesses and stress. According to other rumors, his trusted men delayed the arrival of a doctor as long as possible in order to make sure that the situation was irreversible. In any case, there is no way of knowing what would have happened if a doctor had seen him in time. On March 5, his condition worsened, he vomited blood and suffered a stomach hemorrhage. At 9:50 p.m. he passed away. The next day, the population was informed of the death of the supreme leader of the Soviet Union and a national mourning was declared. A fight broke out within the Communist Party that ended up crowning Nikita Khrushchev as the new general secretary of the party, while Lavrenti Beria was arrested, tried and executed with a shot to the head. This is how the story of Joseph Stalin, who was one of the most powerful men in the world, ended.
Según los historiadores, ese 30 de abril Hitler se suicidó, pero más adelante entraremos en detalle sobre lo que pasó en ese búnker. La noche del 1 de mayo, una radio alemana anunció que Hitler había muerto y el 2 de mayo el Ejército Rojo tomó completamente Berlín. Sin embargo, el cuerpo de Hitler no aparecía, y eso dio pie a múltiples versiones sobre las últimas horas del líder nazi. De hecho, en junio del 45, 2 meses después, las autoridades soviéticas dijeron que no habían podido encontrar los restos de Hitler, y no solo eso, insinuaron que podría seguir con vida.
Adolf Hitler, one of the most important figures in modern history, died on April 30, 1945, as he came to terms with the shattering of his dream of an eternal Third Reich. With its central figure gone, Nazi Germany plunged into a turbulent period from which it would not emerge for years. Mass arrests and executions were just some of the events that occurred during this dark time for the German people. Meanwhile, the fear of Hitler's resurgence lingered. There is no doubt about his death. The evidence is conclusive. There are clear indications that his body was transported far from Berlin. So why were there so many rumors about his survival? What led to this? Today in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Hitler's death and its consequences in Germany and the world. In the final days of April 1945, the European front of the Second World War was coming to an end. German troops were being attacked simultaneously by the Allies in the West and the Soviets in the East. All the territory they had conquered in recent years had been liberated, and now the battles were being fought on their own soil. Berlin was besieged by the Red Army, while German soldiers tried to resist desperately. With a shortage of ammunition, no armored vehicles, outnumbered, and morale destroyed, everyone knew that the end of the Third Reich was inevitable. Everyone except Hitler. He and his most fanatical followers still believed that a miraculous Nazi victory was possible. In his underground bunker in the German capital, the Führer continued to issue increasingly difficult orders to fulfill. On April 22nd, all of Hitler's hopes rested on Commander Felix Steiner. The man was supposed to break through the Soviet encirclement around Berlin and thus relieve the beleaguered defenders. But Steiner made it clear that, due to the small number of his men, this action would not be feasible. When Hitler learned of this, all of his resolve collapsed. It was at this moment that he realized the war was over and that he was on the losing side. From here, according to those present during the scene, he began to plan his death. Let's hear from his secretary describing the mood of the Nazi leader during those days.
Es gab keinen Angriff mehr, es gab keine Verteidigung mehr. Und dann hat Hitler alle Hoffnung verloren und hat sich zurückgezogen, hat sich in sich selbst zurückgezogen, wurde vollkommen stumpf, teilnahmslos, saß im Korridor mit einem von den jungen Hunden. Die Blondie hatte nämlich inzwischen Junge bekommen, die waren da auch noch in dem Bunker, in einem Nebenraum, so in einem Waschraum untergebracht, hat den Welpen auf dem Schoß und hat stumpf vor sich hingestarrt.
In the following days, the German situation rapidly worsened. The Russians were getting closer and closer to the city center, and the defenders were dying in droves, unable to hold back the enemy advance. The general's predictions spoke of a catastrophe. Berlin could hold out at the latest until 30 April. Hitler received the reports in silence, his course of action already resolved. He informed his followers of his decision, making it clear that the surrender of the German army was not a viable option. They must fight to the last man. A day earlier, the Nazi leader had married his mistress, Eva Braun. She had traveled from Munich to Berlin to be with the Führer in his most desperate moments. And now, despite being given the option to flee, she chose to share her husband's fate. Hitler's last order was to burn his corpse in bronze, leaving almost no trace of it. Then their remains were to be buried. He did not want to suffer the same fate as his ally, the dictator Benito Mussolini. He and his mistress had been captured by partisans just 2 days earlier. After their arrest, they were shot and their bodies mutilated and paraded through the streets of Italy. Hitler did not want to go through this humiliation. After bidding farewell to the few remaining party members in the bunker and giving them permission to flee if they so wished, the Führer locked himself in his room with his wife. It was not long before a single shot was heard echoing through the underground shelter. When his followers opened the door, they found him dead from a bullet wound to the temple. Eva Braun, lying on the armchair, had also died from taking a cyanide capsule. This was the death of the greatest architect of the Second World War. But despite the Führer's the Battle of Berlin continued. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Party's propaganda minister, inherited the position of Chancellor of Germany and reiterated Hitler's orders forbidding surrender to the enemy. The capital would be defended to the last drop of blood, but Goebbels would not be part of this fight. Along with his wife Magda, they gave each of their 6 children a morphine injection, under the pretext of protecting them from infection. While sedated and sleeping, they murdered them with cyanide capsules. For the couple, a world without Hitler was not worth living in. We can once again hear from Hitler's secretary, who witnessed this macabre event.
Den Kindern ist gesagt worden, ihr müsst geimpft werden, wenn ihr so nahe beim Onkel Hitler lebt und in dem Bunker, wo so viele Menschen sind. Aber ich habe oft das Gefühl gehabt, dass die Älteste, die Helga, die war ja schon 10, die hatte so traurige Augen und so, die war so still und ich habe das Gefühl, dieses Kind hat irgendwelche Ahnungen gehabt. Es war furchtbar.
Only hours later, Goebbels shot his wife and then put a bullet in his own temple. Once again, the Reich lost its leader. With Hitler and the propaganda minister dead, Nazism found itself without its 2 greatest fanatics. The generals in charge of the forces saw no reason to fight on and sought to sign a surrender with the Soviet Union. It was during these negotiations that Stalin learned of the Führer's death. But his paranoid nature made him distrust this information, and he did not reveal it publicly. Instead, he ordered Smersh, the Soviet counterintelligence unit, to thoroughly search the underground bunker for his supposed corpse. These men came upon a chilling scene. Numerous Reich generals, perhaps too proud to try to escape, were found dead by their own hands in the corridors. In one of the rooms, the Goebbels' son and daughters lay, murdered by their own parents. They found them in the courtyard, just outside the bunker. Although the propaganda minister had also given the order to burn his body and that of his wife, enough of them had been preserved for identification. But there was no trace of the Führer. They had to keep searching. However, the fighting in the city was not over yet. While the leaders of both sides were discussing the terms of German capitulation, the bloodthirsty Red Army was taking its brutal revenge on the civilian population. Any robbery, rape, or murder they committed against citizens was seen as justified based on the crimes the Nazis had carried out on Soviet soil in the previous years. It is difficult to know exactly how many people died or fell victim to these acts, but it is estimated that approximately 100,000 women were sexually abused by Russian men. Many of them, out of shame or trauma, would end up taking their own lives. These were not the only that occurred in Berlin around this time. It could even be said that not only was this a common act, but it was encouraged by the Nazi leadership. For them, committing was an act of honor, whereas surrendering to the Soviets marked one as a coward and a traitor. During this battle, one of the last fought in Europe, it is estimated that almost 4,000 people took their own lives, both civilians and military personnel. Several high-ranking generals, knowing what would happen to them if they fell into Soviet hands, chose this fate. Many of them killed their families first. In many cases, Berliners, motivated by German propaganda, also saw it preferable to die than to be Russian prisoners. As mentioned above, not everything that was said was Nazi fabrications. Wherever the Red Army passed, terrible atrocities were committed against the civilian population under the pretext of seeking revenge. This did not happen only in Berlin. In the German town of Demmin, for example, around 2,000 people committed suicide because of Soviet actions. This number may not seem so high, but it represented only a little less than 10% of the population of the place. Let us listen to a witness from this village.
Fue la primera vez que vi muertos. Colgaban de los manzanos que habían empezado a florecer. Nosotros correteábamos alrededor, robábamos aquí y allá y veíamos cadáveres flotando en el río.
Some believe that many of these had another darker reason. Historians have theories that some people decided to take their own lives because they could not imagine a world without Nazism, or because of the trauma they suffered from battles or Soviet atrocities. But others may have done so because they feared Holocaust retaliation. Contrary to what was once believed, many civilians were aware of what was happening in the concentration camps of Eastern Europe. Many, immersed in the ideology of the party, even supported it. They knew that when these crimes against humanity came to light, they would not be forgiven by the rest of the world. Out of guilt, fear, or shame, they made the drastic decision to end their existence. Germany's unconditional surrender would finally happen on May 8, 1945. The fighting came to an end, although the crimes against the civilian population and the continued for a longer time. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS and one of Hitler's most powerful lieutenants, committed suicide following his capture by the Allies later this month. Martin Bormann, the Führer's personal secretary, also chose this option when his escape from Berlin became difficult. The remaining Nazi leaders, such as Hermann Göring and Karl Dönitz, were imprisoned and would be put on trial in the following months. 601 people were tried at the Nuremberg trials. 11 of them were sentenced to death. Other Nazis of lower rank than these leaders, but no less important, managed to escape. Many went to South America, mainly to Argentina, as was the case of the Dr. Josef Mengele, famous for carrying out inhuman experiments at Auschwitz. However, other officials, mostly scientists, were invited to the United States or the United Kingdom by their own governments, with the intelligence services planning the escapes. Sometimes even the Catholic Church assisted in these escapes, sheltering the criminals in Italian monasteries, sometimes for years. Countries that until very recently were their mortal enemies now offered them work in the development of new weapons, with the intention of stopping the advance of an upcoming rival, communism, led by the Soviet Union. However, Nazis who were of no use to the Western powers, or who were accused of the most serious crimes, were still sought for trial and conviction. One of them was Adolf Hitler himself. Remember that information about the Führer's death had been jealously guarded by Stalin, who did not tell his European allies. He even ordered his intelligence services to fuel rumors of his escape and to brand any claim of his suicide as a fascist trick. In reality, the Soviet leader was almost certain that he had found Hitler's remains, just a few days after the end of the Battle of Berlin. Interrogating the few survivors who had remained in the bunker in the capital, they found the place where the German dictator and his wife had been buried. Although the remains found were few and mostly disintegrated when touched, the dentures remained in relatively good condition. They were quickly ordered to be taken to a surgical hospital for examination. Thanks to the questioning of one of the Nazi leader's surviving doctors, the Soviets came up with the name of his dentist. They didn't find him, but they did find his assistant. She confirmed that the dental records found in the courtyard of the Berlin bunker matched Hitler's, so there was no longer any doubt. The Führer was dead, and his remains were in Russian hands. But that was not what Stalin was saying. At the end of May, he told the US ambassador in Moscow that he believed Hitler had managed to escape without a trace. Perhaps, he said, he had fled to Japan seeking refuge with his allies, or to Spain, where the fascist dictator Francisco Franco had given him shelter. The Red Army generals were also under orders to foster this idea that the Nazi leader was still at large. It was all a ploy to gain a better position than his anti-communist Western rivals. For Stalin, power came from information, as two historians state in the following video.
Почему Сталин не сообщает союзникам?
Warum ließ Stalin seine Verbündeten im Dunkeln? Das ist etwas kompliziert und hat psychologische Gründe. Ein Wissensvorsprung ist stets von Vorteil. Es kann immer nützlich sein, ein Geheimnis zu haben.
Die Geschichte um Hitlers Tod zeigt, wie misstrauisch Stalin dem Westen gegenüber war. Es war ihm wichtig, nicht zu viele Informationen oder Beweise weiterzugeben. Eines Tages könnte es uns ja vielleicht nützlich sein, seine Verbündeten im Unklaren gelassen zu haben.
Disproving these rumors was difficult, as in the following years the American intelligence services received numerous reports of alleged sightings of Hitler. They were not given much importance, but the secrecy with which these reports were treated made the myth permeate the general public. For some people, Hitler's escape was a real possibility. The fear that the infamous figure would reappear and spread his ideology was alive. But the reality was that his remains, those of his wife and those of the Goebbels family, had been buried in an East German village since 1946, except, according to rumors, a fragment of the dictator's skull and some teeth. These were kept by Stalin in his desk in the Moscow Kremlin. Only 3 years after the death of the Soviet leader was a formal death certificate issued for Hitler. What remained of his body was exhumed in 1970 and destroyed by the Russians. According to the final report, it was completely incinerated and ground with pieces of coal until it was pulverized into pulverized ash. Then, he was thrown into the river. Only in 2018, scientists from other countries were allowed to analyze the bones kept by the Soviets and confirm their identification once and for all. Hitler was dead, and his enemies made sure that his ideology would follow in his footsteps. 10% of the German population, around 8 million people, were or had been members of the National Socialist Party. Many tens of millions more belonged to organizations associated with it. Although their leader had been wiped off the map, his ideas lived on in many of these men, women, and children. In the months following the German surrender, the Allies and Soviets began a process of denazification. This sought to erase any kind of Nazi influence in the culture, society, and politics within Germany and Austria, where the Führer had been born. To this end, the entire population was screened for any trace of sympathy for Nazism. But this would be an incredibly difficult mission to accomplish, as a historian tells us in the following video.
What happens is that there are so many people who've made their peace with the Nazi regime, who've been complicit in the Nazi regime, who've been involved in perpetration on behalf of Nazism, that it really is a massive problem.
They quickly realized the impossibility of this task, although a large number of arrests did take place. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent convictions were part of this process. To prevent party ideas from being promulgated through the media, a high level of censorship was applied to radio, newspapers, films, and plays. Books, from fiction to poetry, were banned, and existing copies were confiscated and destroyed. Also, the Western powers planned to eliminate Germany's industrial capacity, practically reverting it to an agricultural model. But they feared that this would lead to such a level of resentment in the civilian population that communism would come to be seen as a friendly ideology. It already ruled over half the country, and the Allies wanted to prevent its spread almost as much as Nazism. The economic sanctions ended up being moderate enough not to turn the majority of German citizens against each other. Thus, with the death of the Führer, Germany went from being the sworn enemy of both the Western Allies and the Soviet Communists to one of the main interests of both in the new Cold War. The two sides would fight over the country continuously throughout the second half of the 20th century, until the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the end of the century. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think Stalin's secrecy regarding Hitler's death was justified? We await your response in the comments box, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.